Imagine spending 40 years making an entire nation laugh. Your face on television every week, your name on cinema posters, strangers stopping you on the street just to say thank you. And then imagine lying in a hospital bed and not a single person knowing you were there. No family at the door, no colleague on the phone, no friend in the corridor. Just the sound of the ward around you and the kind of silence that nobody who watched you perform ever thought would find you. This is not a story about fame. This is a story about what fame cannot protect you from. 14 British stars, 14 real names that you will recognize, and 14 endings that the industry that profited from them would rather you never thought about. And number one is Kenneth Williams. Kenneth Williams was one of the most recognizable voices in British entertainment history. The Carry On films, Round the Horn on BBC Radio, dozens of chat show appearances where his sharp wit and outrageous comic timing made him appointment viewing for millions of British households across 4 decades. He was a national institution, the kind of performer whose voice alone, before you even saw his face, told you that something funny was about to happen. Behind that voice was a man of profound and documented loneliness. Williams kept diaries throughout his adult life, obsessive, detailed, brutally honest documents of his interior world that were published after his death and shocked readers who thought they knew him. The diaries describe a man for whom the public performance of joy and extroversion was precisely that, a performance. In private, he lived alone in a 1-bedroom flat in Osnibber Street, London, for most of his adult life. His closest companion was his mother, Louie, who lived in a separate flat in the same building. In February 1988, Lizzie Williams died. She was the anchor of his daily life, the one consistent human presence in an existence that his diaries describe as otherwise painfully isolated. 2 months after losing her, in April 1988, Kenneth Williams was found dead in his flat. He was 62 years old. The cause was a barbiturate overdose. The coroner recorded an open verdict, unable to establish with certainty whether it was accidental or deliberate. He had been suffering serious stomach pain in his final weeks and had visited doctors, but in those weeks after Lewis's death, there was no one close enough to notice how serious things had become. Britain mourned loudly when the news broke. Tributes poured in from across the entertainment world. Kenneth Williams, who had spent a career making others feel less alone, died in the specific loneliness he had been writing about in private for 40 years. If he left behind any final irony, and he would have insisted on one, it was that the nation grieving him at the end was the same nation he had never quite been able to let close enough to help him. At number 2 is Richard Beckinsale. In the late 1970s, Richard Beckinsale was one of the most beloved faces on British television. His performance as Lenny Godbeer in Porridge, the young, slightly hapless prisoner navigating life alongside Ronnie Barker's Norman Stanley Fletcher, made him a household name with a warmth and naturalism that felt entirely effortless. He followed it with Rising Damp, another classic, alongside Leonard Rossier. He was 31 years old and at the absolute beginning of what should have been a long and defining career. On the 19th of March, 1979, Beckinsale collapsed at his home in Haslemere, Surrey. He was rushed to hospital. He died of a massive heart attack caused by a severe coronary artery condition that had never been detected. He had shown no signs of serious illness. There had been no warning. He had just finished filming a new project. His daughter, Kate, who would grow up to become a major actress herself, was 5 years old. The cruelty of Beckinsale's story is its complete absence of warning. There was no slow decline, no period of illness during which support could have gathered around him, no time for the people who loved him to prepare or to say what needed to be said. He was simply there one day and gone the next, taken by a condition that British medicine of the era had no reason to look for in a healthy, active man in his early 30s. What makes his name belong in this film is the specific quality of abandonment that sudden death creates. Not the abandonment of neglect, but the abandonment of a life cut off before it had run its course. His daughter grew up with a father she barely knew. His colleagues lost someone irreplaceable before they understood what they had, and Britain lost an actor who had barely begun to show what he was capable of. The hospital that received him that March evening could do nothing. The heart that had powered one of television's warmest performances simply stopped. At number 3 is Leonard Rosser. Leonard Rosser achieved something that very few actors manage. He created two entirely separate, iconic television characters in two entirely different series and made both of them completely convincing. Reginald Perrin in The Fall and Rise of Reginald Perrin and Rupert Rigsby in Rising Damp were as different as two characters could be. And Rossiter inhabited both with a precision and comic intensity that made his work look effortless while being, by the account of everyone who worked with him, the product of obsessive preparation and ferocious professional perfectionism. He died on the 5th of October, 1984, backstage at the Lyric Theatre in London during the interval of a performance of the play Loot. He was 57 years old. He had complained of feeling unwell during the first half of the performance, but had continued. During the interval, he collapsed in his dressing room. By the time help arrived, he was gone. A heart attack, sudden and complete. The audience in the theater did not know for some time what had happened to the man who had been performing for them an hour earlier. The image of Rossiter dying alone in a theater dressing room, in the interval of a performance, having pushed through the first half despite not feeling well, in the specific professional stubbornness that defined his entire approach to his work, is one of the most quietly devastating in British entertainment history. He was a man who performed through discomfort as a matter of principle, and that principle was, in the end, what the final evening of his life looked like. His wife and family were not with him. His colleagues were preparing for the second half. The dressing room where he died was, for those critical minutes, entirely empty of anyone who could help. At number 4 is Tony Hancock. Tony Hancock was, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the biggest name in British comedy. Hancock's Half Hour, first on BBC Radio and then on BBC television, reached audiences of extraordinary size and generated a cultural impact that shaped British comedy for decades after it ended. His specific comic persona, the pompous, self-diluting, perpetually disappointed man of Eastsham, was a creation of such precision and humanity that it has never been replicated. By 1968, Hancock was in Sydney, Australia, attempting to film a new television series. The British career he had once dominated had been dismantled by his own decisions. He had famously and disastrously fired his writing partners, Ray Galton and Alan Simpson, the men whose scripts had been the foundation of his greatness, and had spent years attempting to prove he could succeed without them. He could not. Each subsequent venture failed. His personal life, multiple marriages, serious alcohol dependency, had collapsed around him. He was found dead in his Sydney apartment on the 25th of June, 1968. He had taken an overdose of barbiturates. He was 44 years old. He left a note that spoke of things simply having gone wrong and expressed apologies to those he had let down. He had been in Australia without the support network that even his diminished life in Britain had provided. No close friend nearby, no family member who knew how serious things had become, no colleague from the world that had once celebrated him who was close enough to intervene. The specific abandonment of Tony Hancock's final chapter was partly self-created. The burning of bridges that had characterized his later career had isolated him from people who genuinely cared about him. But it was also the abandonment of an industry that had no mechanism for supporting a performer in crisis. He had been enormously valuable when he was functioning. When he stopped functioning, the industry moved on. He was left in a Sydney apartment with his regrets, his talent, and nothing else. At number 5 is Frankie Howerd. Frankie Howerd was one of the most singular comic talents Britain produced in the 20th century. A performer whose relationship with his audience was so intimate, so peculiarly conversational, that watching him felt less like attending a performance and more like being confided in by someone who found the world simultaneously hilarious and appalling. His career spanned 5 decades and included periods of such dramatic revival, most famously at the Establishment Club in the early 1960s and again in Up Pompeii in the 1970s, that he became a case study in the possibility of reinvention. His private life was one of the most carefully concealed in British entertainment. Howerd was gay at a time when homosexuality was first criminal and then merely socially dangerous for a public figure of his profile. He maintained a long-term relationship with his manager, Dennis Hammer. That was the central fact of his personal life and the central secret of his public one. The concealment cost him not financially or professionally, since it was successfully maintained, but in the specific psychological toll of living a divided existence for decades. He died on the 19th of April, 1992, of heart failure at his home in Kensington. He was 74 years old. Dennis Hammer was with him. The man who had been his companion and manager for decades was present at the end, which places Howard in a slightly different position from others on this list. But the abandonment in Howard's story is of a different and longer duration. The abandonment of a public that adored him while being entirely unaware of who he actually was. The abandonment of an industry that required his secret as a condition of his success, and the specific loneliness of a man who performed intimacy with millions of strangers while the most intimate fact of his life was kept permanently off stage. At number 6 is Sid James. Sid James was South African-born, but became as quintessentially associated with a certain kind of British working-class comedy as any performer of his era. His laugh, that specific, unmistakable dirty chuckle, was as recognizable as any sound in British entertainment. 24 Carry-On films, Hancock's Half Hour, blessed this house. He was a fixture, a reliable and beloved presence across 3 decades of British screens. On the 26th of April, 1976, Sid James was on stage at the Sunderland Empire Theatre performing in the mating season. Midway through the performance, he suffered a massive heart attack on stage. The audience initially did not fully understand what they were seeing. Some thought it was part of the performance. He was carried off stage and rushed to hospital. He died shortly after arrival. He was 62 years old. The image of Sid James dying on stage in front of a live audience, mid-performance, in a provincial theater, is one that those who were present have described in terms that remain difficult to read. The confusion of the audience, the scramble of the cast, the awful gap between the comedy they had come to see and the reality unfolding in front of them. His wife Valerie and his family were not present that evening. He died in a hospital in Sunderland, far from home, surrounded by medical staff who were strangers. He had a history of heart problems. A previous heart attack in 1967 had been a serious warning. He had continued working at the pace that his career demanded and his financial obligations required because the carry-on machine and the touring theater world did not make comfortable provision for slowing down. The heart that powered 30 years of that unmistakable laugh gave out in a Sunderland hospital, in a city he was passing through, with nobody who knew him well enough to hold his hand. At number 7 is Benny Hill. Benny Hill was, at the peak of his fame, one of the most watched entertainers on the planet. The Benny Hill Show was broadcast in over 100 countries. In France, in Germany, in the United States, his face was as recognizable as any British export in entertainment history. He was a global phenomenon built from a very specific English comic tradition, seaside postcard humor, music hall timing, and a physical comedy instinct that was genuinely gifted. He died alone. That fact is documented, undisputed, and remains one of the most stark contrasts between fame and reality in British entertainment history. He was found dead in his flat in Teddington, West London, on the 20th of April, 1992, just one day after Frankie Howard, in a grim coincidence that the tabloids noted with the insensitivity that tabloids bring to such moments. He had been dead for several days before anyone found him. He was 67 years old. The cause was a heart attack. Benny Hill had no wife, no children, no close family living nearby. He had friends and colleagues, but the specific architecture of his daily life, the habits, the routines, the careful privacy he had maintained throughout his career meant that there was no one whose expectation of his regular contact would trigger concern quickly enough. He had been having health problems. He had recently been dropped by Thames Television after years of controversy about the nature of his comedy. He had been, in the industry's estimation, yesterday's man. The millions of people who had watched him around the world had no mechanism for knowing he needed someone. The industry that had broadcast him to 100 countries had no system for noticing he had not been seen. He lay in his flat in Teddington for several days, one of the most famous men in British entertainment history, before the world understood he was gone. At number 8 is Peter Sayers. Peter Sayers was considered by many of his contemporaries to be the most purely gifted comic actor of his generation. His range was extraordinary. Inspector Clouseau in the Pink Panther films, the multiple roles in Doctor Strangelove, Quilty in Lolita, performances of technical precision and comic invention that placed him in a conversation with the very greatest screen performers of any era. He was also, by the account of almost everyone who knew him well, one of the most difficult and self-destructive people in the film industry. Sellers suffered a series of heart attacks in 1964 that came close to killing him and left him with permanent cardiac damage that he spent the next 16 years largely ignoring. His personal life was a sequence of marriages, for in total, each of which ended with the specific damage that his psychological instability and professional obsession inflicted on anyone who tried to build a life with him. He was a man who, by his own admission, had no self outside the characters he played, a statement that his friends and former wives confirmed was not false modesty, but a genuine and terrifying psychological reality. He suffered a massive heart attack in London in July 1980 and was taken to the Middlesex Hospital. He died there on the 24th of July at 54 years old. His fourth wife, Lynn Frederick, was present at the hospital. But the broader isolation of his final years, the relationships he had burned, the colleagues he had alienated, the family members whose patience he had exhausted, meant that the community of support that a man of his stature might have expected had been, through his own actions and the actions of an industry that used him until he broke, largely dismantled. His daughter Sarah Miles described the experience of having Peter Sayers as a father with an honesty that is genuinely painful to read. A man who was present and then absent, consuming and then cold, extraordinary and then utterly unreachable. He died in a hospital with fewer people at his side than his talent had deserved. The films remain. The man who made them died, running from himself. At number 9 is Diana Dors. Diana Dors was Britain's answer to Marilyn Monroe, a platinum blonde actress of considerable presence and genuine talent who was packaged and sold by the British film industry of the 1950s as a sex symbol. While her actual abilities as a dramatic actress were systematically underexplored, she was glamorous, she was funny, she was sharper than the roles she was given, and she spent 3 decades navigating an industry that had decided what she was before she had the opportunity to show them what else she could be. By the early 1980s, Dors had reinvented herself with considerable success as a television personality and actress. Her appearances on shows like The Two Ronnies and her own chat program demonstrated the warmth and wit that her earlier career had only partially captured. She was also seriously ill. She had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer in 1982 and had undergone treatment, but by 1984 the disease had progressed. She died on the 4th of May, 1984, at the Cromwell Hospital in London. She was 52 years old. Her husband, actor Alan Lake, was with her, but Lake was himself in serious psychological difficulty, consumed by grief over her illness and his own struggles. He took his own life 4 months after her death. The picture of Diana Dors in her final months, ill in a hospital with a husband who loved her but was himself barely holding together, is one of mutual fragility rather than solid support. She died far younger than she should have from a disease that was diagnosed too late in a woman who had spent decades being told that her body was a commercial product rather than something deserving of careful attention. The industry that had packaged and sold Diana Dors did not attend her bedside. The woman who had been Britain's blonde bombshell died at 52 in a London hospital, leaving behind a husband who could not survive her loss by more than a few months. At number 10 is Terry Thomas. Terry Thomas was one of British cinema's most celebrated comic actors of the 1950s and 1960s. The gap-toothed, cigarette-holder-wielding, magnificently caddish upper-class bounder whose specific brand of comic villain made him beloved in Britain and internationally successful in Hollywood productions. His work in films like School for Scoundrels and It's a Mad, 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 Mad World gave him a profile that extended far beyond British shores. In the late 1960s, Terry Thomas was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. The diagnosis was, in its long-term implications, a professional death sentence delivered with the particular cruelty of a degenerative condition. Slowly, progressively, over years, removing from him the physical precision and comic timing that had been the instruments of his entire career. He continued working for as long as he could, appearing in productions of declining quality as his condition advanced because the financial reality of his situation demanded it, and because stopping meant confronting what was happening to him. By the early 1980s, he was in serious financial difficulty. His savings had been managed poorly during the healthy years, and the combination of reduced income and mounting medical costs had left him in genuine hardship. The entertainment industry became aware of his situation through a newspaper article, and a benefit fund was organized by fellow entertainers that raised enough to provide him with some security in his final years. He died in January 1990 in a nursing home in Godalming, Surrey. He was 78 years old. The image of Terry Thomas in a nursing home, the man who had played the most magnificently self-assured retares in British comedy, reduced by disease and financial hardship to dependency on charity from his colleagues, is one of the sharpest contrasts between screen persona and private reality on this list. He was not entirely alone. The fund that supported him reflected genuine affection from people who remembered what he had given. But the years between diagnosis and death were years of progressive loss. And the industry that had benefited so handsomely from his talent was not there until his colleagues shamed it into action. At number 11 is Roy Coner. Roy Coner was one of those actors who appeared in what felt like everything. A character actor of such range and reliability that British film and television of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s would be substantially diminished without him. The Beatles' help, The Three Musketeers, Willy Wonka, and The Chocolate Factory, countless British television productions. He brought a specific quality of lived inhumanity to every role he took. The kind of performance that makes a scene feel real rather than filmed. In September 1988, Coner was in Toledo, Spain, filming The Return of the Musketeers, a reunion of the cast of Richard Lester's earlier Musketeer films, which had been some of the best work of his career. He fell from a horse during filming. The fall caused serious injuries. He was taken to hospital in Madrid. He died the following day, on the 20th of September, 1988, from a heart attack brought on by his injuries. He was 54 years old. His death in a Spanish hospital, away from his family in a foreign city, in circumstances that have since been the subject of legal proceedings regarding the safety conditions on the production, carries the specific quality of institutional abandonment rather than personal neglect. The production that had placed him on that horse in those conditions had not adequately managed the risks involved. The legal proceedings that followed his death established that the circumstances were not simply tragic accident, but reflected failures of duty of care that should not have occurred. His wife, Carmel, and their children were in England when he died. He was in a Madrid hospital with colleagues who were themselves in shock and medical staff who did not know him. The film industry that had employed him continuously for over 20 years sent him to Spain, put him on a horse, and did not bring him home. At number 12 is Hattie Jacques. Hattie Jacques was adored by British audiences across 2 decades of carry-on films and extensive television work. Her comic authority, her warmth, and her ability to find the human truth inside the broadest comedy made her one of the most genuinely beloved performers of her generation. She was not simply a supporting player in the carry-on machine. She was a pillar of it, a performer whose presence gave the films a weight and a heart that the scripts alone could not have provided. Her personal life had been damaged by the breakdown of her marriage to actor John the Measure, who left her for a younger woman in 1965 in circumstances that those who knew Jacques described as devastating. She continued working, continued delivering, continued being the consummate professional that the industry required. But the personal wound did not fully heal, and the years that followed were years of emotional difficulty that she managed largely in private, because her public persona, warm, capable, unshakable, left no room for visible vulnerability. She suffered a series of heart attacks in the late 1970s. The Carry On series was in serious decline by this point, and the financial security that steady work had provided was no longer consistent. She died in October 1980 at her home in Earl's Court, London. She was 58 years old, far too young, and in circumstances of comparative isolation that the woman who had warmed millions of British living rooms deserved not to have faced. The colleagues who had shared sets with her for 20 years mourned her. The industry that had relied on her moved on. At number 13 is Wilfrid Bramble. Wilfrid Bramble achieved genuine television immortality as Albert Streppod in Stedo and Son, the filthy, manipulative, magnificently horrible old rag and bone man whose relationship with his long-suffering son Harold, played by Harry H. Corbett, produced some of the finest writing and performing in British television history. The show ran from 1962 to 1974 and has never been out of public affection since. Bramble and Corbett were considered by many critics the finest double act in British television. The relationship between Bramble and Harry H. Corbett, on-screen a study in trapped, bitter, complicated love, was off-screen considerably less warm. By various accounts, the two men did not like each other, a fact that gave their performances an authenticity of tension that the writing alone could not have manufactured, but that made the working relationship an ongoing source of difficulty. When the show ended, the professional bond that had defined both their careers dissolved without leaving much in the way of personal connection. Bramble died in January 1985 in a London hospital of cancer. He was 72 years old. He had never married. His final years had been relatively quiet, the kind of quiet that follows an iconic role that overshadowed everything before and after it. The man who had played the most memorable dirty old man in British television history died in a hospital bed with the specific loneliness that a long career, a private personal life, and the absence of the family structures that sustain people through illness can produce. Albert Stedo was beloved. Wilfrid Bramble died, largely without the companionship that his creation had enjoyed on screen. At number 14 is Warren Mitchell. Warren Mitchell achieved a cultural impact through one role that few actors in any era have matched. His portrayal of Alf Garnett in Till Death Us Do Part, the bigoted, loud, magnificently ignorant East End patriarch whose function in the series was to demonstrate the ugliness of prejudice through the comedy of its most extreme expression. The show was controversial from its first broadcast in 1965 and has never stopped being discussed. Mitchell's performance was so complete, so entirely inhabited, that many viewers, to the frustration of the show's creator Johnny Spate, took Alf Garnett at face value rather than as satire. Mitchell was Jewish, a fact that gave his portrayal of Garnett's casual anti-Semitism a specific and private dimension that he discussed in interviews with considerable thoughtfulness. He was a serious actor, a trained performer who brought a classical rigor to a populist comedy role and who spent the years away from Garnett doing stage work of real distinction, including a celebrated performance as Willie O'Man in Death of a Salesman. He died in November 2015 at the age of 89 in a care home. He had been suffering from dementia in his final years, a cruel condition for a man whose instrument had been his intelligence and his precision. His wife of many decades had predisposed him. The dementia had taken, gradually and then completely, the very faculties that had made Warren Mitchell who he was. He died in a care home attended by staff rather than family, in the specific anonymity that dementia imposes on those it consumes. The person retreating from the face while the face remains. He had lived a long life and a full one, which distinguishes him from some others on this list. But the final years, the progressive loss, the institutional care, the fading of the man who had created one of British television's most indelible characters, represent the particular abandonment of age and illness that the entertainment industry has no answer for, and that fame provides no protection against whatsoever. 14 names, every one of them familiar. Every one of them part of the fabric of British entertainment that this country grew up watching. And every one of them, at the moment it mattered most, without the protection that their decades of work should have earned them. Fame is loud. It fills rooms. It generates column inches and fan letters and the kind of public warmth that can feel, from the outside, like a form of love. But fame cannot sit with you in a hospital ward. Fame cannot notice that you have not been seen for 3 days. Fame cannot hold your hand when the corridor goes quiet and the visiting hours are over and the night comes in. These 14 people gave Britain something real, something lasting. The very least we can do is remember not just the performances, but the people who gave them, and ask ourselves honestly, did we do enough? This has been Abandoned in Hospital. Thank you for watching.